Hey guys, it's Thomas, and in this video we're going to talk about how you can implement Wix Table elements to your website built on Velo. This video is actually a part 2 of a series where we started building a Bitcoin exchange calculator and talked about the advantages of using state management tools such as MobX to update the view of your website whenever the state changes automatically. This is beneficial when you're writing code because you don't want to have to manually update the visuals because you'll end up writing a lot of code that is repetitive, as we'll see later in this video. And the main advantage of using states instead is that you're sure that whatever is being displayed to the user is the most current data that's saved. So what we're going to do first is check out our previous code from the last part, and then we're going to see how to implement a Wix table element that's going to give the user some basic values as soon as they head to the page. Let's get started. So when the user loads this page, they can type in how much Bitcoin they have, and automatically the calculator will convert it to the default currency. Right now we have US dollar selected, but in the future we'll implement it to also convert it to other currencies. In this video, we're going to actually implement this table element down here, and we're going to create rows that show some basic values so the user doesn't have to necessarily type in half a Bitcoin, 1/10 of a Bitcoin, and so on. So on the home page, we can see that we imported autorun and observable, and these are two main concepts within MobX that we talked about in the last video. Autorun is a way to run a function automatically when a state change is detected, and observable is something that allows you to save states and use it throughout all of your site. So you can see that when the key is pressed inside of the following input up here, the actual state is changed. And when the state is changed, that causes the currency value, which is displayed in the input right here, to also change. What we're going to do now is take a look at one way to implement Wix table elements, and we'll also see an example of this website being coded using jQuery-style code and talk about the advantages of using state management instead. So if I hit preview, you can see that the Bitcoin value is here, and down here we have some basic values. That way the user doesn't have to type anything to see some values that may be commonly requested. If we go back to the editor and check out our code, the first thing that jumps out immediately is there's no imported MobX package, and all of the state is being saved in regular let variables. On top of that, whenever the state changes, you can see that the view also has to be manually implemented. So as an example of that, when the user types in something into BTC amount, which is this input right here, and on key press is detected, first we have to change the variable BTC amount, which stores the state, and then right after that we take that value and change the value that's displayed in the following input right here, which is named currency value. So to make the table element actually display something, the first thing we need to do is create a function that stores the data structure with all of the row data. So down here we have a function called setTableData, and you can see that it returns an array that has elements inside of it, each of which are an object, and the keys to these objects represent the title for each column that's inside of the table. So if we take a look at our preview, you can see that we have two columns, Bitcoin parentheses BTC and USD. And if we go back to home, inside of each object, you can see that there's an appropriate key for each one of those rows. With table elements, there's this property called dataFetcher, which allows you to give it a function that will be called whenever you refresh the data onto the actual display. So right here, you can see that we selected the table element. And for the property.dataFetcher, we told it to use the getRows function. And if we look down here, we have a function called getRows that returns a promise, which can be used to create the data structure that we need to actually display stuff on the table. As you can see, our data structure is static, so it doesn't depend on calling an API, but the advantage of using dataFetcher as a property is that you can call an API right in this function right here, especially if it's an open API that doesn't require any sort of authentication, right in the front end. And then automatically, whenever the table is refreshed, you can call that API and it will automatically refresh each row with whatever data it gets in. Taking a look at this code, you can see that there's a lot of different places where by forgetting just one line of code, you can accidentally either not change the front end or not change the variables that store the state. And there's also a lot of points here where code is repeated. So if we didn't have this setTableData function right here, we would have to repeat this data structure over and over again whenever we're updating the columns. For example, when we refresh the price, all of these values down here would need to be refreshed again. So what we're going to do now is head over to our original code from the last video and implement the Wix table element using not dataFetcher, but another property that allows us to directly set each row. So if we take a look at our old code, you can see that by default, the Bitcoin amount is going to be set to 40,000. So the first thing we're going to do is make it a little bit more interesting and create a backend function to set the value to a new one whenever we hit on the refresh button. The reason we're doing this is basically to simulate the price changing whenever we hit refresh. That way we can see the changes propagate into the Wix table element. So to make this backend function, we're going to head over to the public and backend, and we're going to click on Add Web Module, and we're just going to call this Bitcoin Prices. We're going to open up this JavaScript web module, and let's get rid of the boilerplate code. And to make it interesting, we're going to create a function that returns a value between 0 and 49,999. So we're going to write export function, and we're going to call this get Bitcoin price. And then we're going to return math.random times 50,000. And just to make it an even number to make our chart simpler, we're going to also use the math.floor function. This way the rate that's shown is not a decimal. Next, we're going to head over to the page code and make it so that whenever we hit the refresh button, it's going to change the state to have that new value inside of it. So we're going to go to home, and then we're going to add an event handler to the refresh button so that whenever we click it, it changes the state of the rate variable. So we're going to go back to the editor, click on the button, go into the code panel, and then we'll click on click and hit the plus button, which adds an event. And now we have some boilerplate that allows us to write a on-click handler. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually turn this function into an asynchronous one. And the reason for this is we want our function to simulate calling an API of some sort, and that API is going to return a promise. So since we're going to have some sort of asynchronous code in there, we're going to do that right now. And then what we're going to do is create a variable to store the API's price, or in this case, the random function's price that gets returned. So we're going to call it let price equal to await get Bitcoin price. And as you can see, it's not imported currently, so we're going to go back to the top and import it. So we're going to say import get Bitcoin price from backend slash Bitcoin prices. And just to make sure that the function is named correctly, it's called get Bitcoin price. We've imported it as that, and down here it's called get Bitcoin price. What we're going to do next is actually change the state to store this new value. So if we scroll back to the observable function, we can see that we have three variables, one get function and one setter function. What we're going to do is create a new setter function to change this variable right here, and then we're going to call it inside of this function down here. So we're going to say this new function is going to be called updateRate. It's going to accept one parameter called amount, and then we're going to say this dot rate is equal to amount. So now we have a way to actually change the state within MobX. And when we go down here, we're going to change the state. So we're going to say state.updateRate, and we're going to pass in that value. And it's going to then change the state using that random value that we created earlier. So if we hit save, and then preview what we have so far, you can see that when I hit refresh, the value gets changed to a random whole number. Now let's go back to our editor and actually implement this table down here. So in order to put data onto the Wix table element, we need to create a data structure that stores each row. So what we're going to do is create another getter, which is going to return a computed value based on the state variables that we saved so far. Basically, we want to take a certain amount and multiply it by the rate to get the current value for each row. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another get function below this one called getTableData, and we're going to return an array, and inside the array are going to be objects that have the columns for the table that we created. So if we go back to the visual editor, we can see that we have one column called Bitcoin BTC parentheses and another one called USD. So those are the key pairs that we're going to use. So let's just keep this open so we can see it. And now we'll make two key value pairs, one for each column. So for the first one, we're going to call it Bitcoin BTC, because that's what it's called up here. And then we're going to make that equal to 1. So that means the first row is going to display 1 Bitcoin. And the second key value pair we're going to create is USD, which is this column right here. So we'll type USD. And for this, we're going to make it equal to state.rate, which represents the current value of Bitcoin according to whatever's saved inside of the rate variable. And then we're going to multiply that by 1, because that's what we're trying to display for this particular row. And then basically we'll take this object and create multiple ones, one for each row that we want to display. So let's do that now. So I'll display 5 different values, and I'll make this one 1/10, and each row will have another 0. So and then we'll also add it to the first column, so it makes sense. So after we add a comma and also commas between each one of these objects, what we're going to do now is use this data structure to actually fill in the Wix table element. So we're going to go down here to autorun, and we're going to create another one. So we're going to say autorun, give it a callback function, and then we're going to select the table element. So we're going to say $W, and it's called BTC table, and we're going to say dot rows. So before we use the dot data catcher property, but in this case we're going to use the dot rows property, which allows us to directly set a data structure to the table, and then it would automatically refresh the values that are displayed. So we're going to say BTC table dot rows is equal to state dot table data. And now if we save and preview, you can see that when we load the page initially, the Bitcoin exchange calculator has the rate of 40,000, and the table down here displays some basic values that will help the user not have to type in anything. And if we hit refresh, since the rate has changed, so has the data for the table. If you head over to the Velo API reference, you can see that there are many other functions that you can use with Wix table elements. Another cool feature that you might want to use is pagination. So if you had a table that had a whole bunch of rows, you may want to display it on different pages within the table. And this is something that allows you to create a table that has a set number of rows per page. In this video, we went over 2 ways to implement Wix table elements, and we also saw the advantages of using state management tools like MobX rather than writing your code in the jQuery style. In the next video, we're going to go over how to actually implement a real API to get actual rates, and also how to implement Wix drop-down elements in order to change the currency whenever the user selects a different one. Stay tuned for the next part of this series.